Yeah, let me begin with a quote from Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth in 1961, where he writes, "Colonialism and imperialism have not settled their debt to us once they have withdrawn from our territories. The wealth of the imperialist nations is also our wealth. Europe is literally the creation of the Third World." Now, this I think is an eloquent uh, explanation, elucidation of the logic underlying demands for reparations. Now, and there was an article written in the New Statesman in 2024 that came out with a left case against slavery reparations, which I think was an interesting article, should be read, if not accepted in its conclusions. But it does note that pro reparations campaigners can point to precedents of that a larger reparations program could follow. In 2021, Germany officially recognized and apologized for the genocides committed against the Herero and Nama peoples and agreed to pay $1.3 billion to the Namibian state through existing aid programs, though it was worded delicately to avoid the word reparations. And Britain itself has officially apologized and given reparations to the Kenyans it tortured during the Mau Mau revolt in the 1950s. If apology and compensation was possible in these cases, then why not for Atlantic slavery and colonialism? Now, there are there are cases of people on the left who have come out against reparations, and among them the young Frantz Fanon. So, in contrast to the first quote that I give of Frantz Fanon from *The Wretched of the Earth* in 1961 and 1954, in *Black Skin, White Mask*, he writes in the conclusion, "I have neither the right nor the duty to claim reparations for the domestication of my ancestors. Am I going to ask the contemporary white man to answer for the slave ships of the 17th century? I do not have to have the right to be mired in what the past has determined. I am not the slave to the slavery that dehumanized my ancestors. There is no Negro mission. There is no white burden. I, as a man of color, want only this, that the enslavement of man by man cease forever." Now, Fanon and other black radicals like CLR James and Kwame Nkrumah, they tell us in this article, were against reparations because they still reflect the relationship of paternalism and dependency that defined the colonial relationship. But more crucially, they enchain black people to the scars of the past, where their identity and subjectivity must forever be determined by slavery and colonialism with no hope of transcending it. Against this historical determinism, they put their faith in freedom and the exciting undetermined possibilities of the future. So this idea of the future and freedom as opposed to the past and dependency. So as we can see, Fanon had contradictory things to say about reparations. At the end of *Black Skin, White Mask*, he rejects them on the grounds that it mires subjectivity in the past. But in *The Wretched of the Earth*, by contrast, he speaks of the debt owed by the colonizers to the colonized. In Fanon's ambivalence, we can observe some of the basic contradictions of the reparations phenomenon. Now, the imprisoned Kurdish leader Abdullah Öcalan seems unaware of the debate about reparations. Nevertheless, it is possible to apply democratic and federalist principles to articulate an Öcalanist position on reparations. For starters, Öcalan is skeptical of financial fixes for problems of disempowerment. Instead, he argues for the urgency of people power and against the usurpations of popular sovereignty by elites in the state. As Piketty has documented, financial wealth does tend to accumulate in the hands of the wealthy. Öcalan is opposed to statist solutions to social problems. He is a libertarian socialist, distrustful of the state, and Öcalan's perspective would urge us to treat with suspicion the role of state elites in many reparation schemes. More fundamentally, Öcalan believes that the opposite of colonization is freedom, and that therefore the truly decolonizing move is to construct institutions of popular people's power. Reparations can be part of this broader program by linking reparations to the economic liberation of a core of full-time cadres committed to forging people power. For example, to the extent that reparations can go to the class who Fanon called the wretched of the earth, they would seem most certainly progressive. But to the extent that they favor formerly colonized elites, their progressiveness is somehow more questionable. But the case of the so-called colonial emergency against the Mau Mau in Kenya is a particularly salient case in point. In 2013, the British government agreed to pay some £20 million to victims of torture from the emergency. This is a concrete case with tort compensation for specific victims. It is a bit different from reparations for colonialism in general because they are not as specific of victims nor as specific of crimes, or rather they are specific enough, the evils of colonialism, but not necessarily reducible to specific individuals. In addition, the Western legal model's individualistic focus is ill-equipped to recognize and remedy systemic injustice, as an article uh, has recently put it, such as slavery, genocide, colonial exploitation, and decades of austerity imposed under the auspices of the IMF and the World Bank. The subject of reparations for colonialism is, of course, intimately related to debates surrounding the slave trade. It was for Walter Rodney the combined effect of the slave trade with later colonialism through which Europe underdeveloped Africa. The Berlin Conference presents a historical occasion in which the crimes of colonialism in Africa were plasmated and rendered concrete. To call colonialism a crime is to suggest both that there are perpetrators who can be held accountable and victims who can be compensated for what was done. People were driven from their ancestral lands. People were forced to work for European cash. People were tortured and massacred when they rebelled. All these are criminal actions in relation to the regime of universal human rights. But then there's the somehow less tangible denial of self-determination which was involved. When I asked a Kurdish friend with close ties to the Kurdish freedom movement what he thought about reparations, he replied, "They're helpful but reformist." The connotations of the word reformist, at least as used here, are certainly negative, almost reminiscent of the use Rosa Luxemburg made of it in the title of her book, Revolution or Reform, but not quite, since he admits that they are nevertheless useful. What does it mean to call reparations useful? It could refer to their symbolic significance in relation to the dialectic of recognition which Charles Taylor, following Hegel, made so famous a few decades ago. It could be more material, as in expanding the material resources and opportunities of those populations who have been subject to colonialism, though here questions of distributive mechanisms arise. The crimes of colonialism are many and most heinous and grave indeed. Reparations are most certainly in order. Of what kind and to whom? The answers to these questions are bound to be contentious. I would argue, in the spirit of the imprisoned Kurdish leader Abdullah Öcalan, that ultimately the repair most fundamentally needed involves the restructuring of the very fabric of society along radical democratic, indeed democratic and federal lines. But before I sketch the logic of this Öcalanist line, let me first adumbrate the argument in favor of reparations. Here, the work of Walter Rodney, in particular his classic book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, sets the parameters for the subsequent discussion. In that book, Rodney persuasively makes the case that the combination of the slave trade and colonialism devastated the continent of Africa. Others have made the converse argument that Africa effectively developed Europe. There is a historic debt which has been forged, and the neo-colonial situation in which African states are immersed and enmeshed only reinforced the plunder of the continent. This latter point was first and perhaps best articulated by Nkrumah after he had been dislodged from power via coup. The depictions of Rodney and Nkrumah both converge around a diagnosis that colonialism and neo-colonialism are to blame for the plight of contemporary Africa. Fanon, too, has a scathing account of the evils of colonialism and a far-sighted prediction about the vices of the national bourgeoisie. Sankara puts his finger on the pulse of finance to diagnose where the neo-colonial noose could be found. The plunder of resources and finances from the African continent continues apace in the 21st century. How to repair this situation? A democratic and federal solution would seem required. Thank you very much.